Alright, so let's take a look at where we left off last time. I can move around my ship with the WASD keys. I can also click the left mouse button and I can drop these little pellets around the scene. Now the reason why they're floating there is I have use gravity off. Let's also turn off is kinematic for a second. We'll refer back to that later. What I'd like to do is when I left click the mouse, I'd like the projectile to fire forward. So let's go ahead and create a script. So I'm going to right click in the scripts folder, go to create C# script, and I'm going to call this proton and shot. And this will just refer back to this. And I'm going to left click and just drag this on top of the proton shot model. Or prefab rather. So when I select this prefab here, you can see down below I have this proton shot script. Now let's go ahead and double click this, or you can go here and do edit script, or you can double click the script here, and let's open this up in Visual Studio and take a look at creating some code to move this forward. Okay, so here we are inside of our proton shot script. Now one of the first things I want to do is get a reference to the rigid body that's attached to the object, and I'm going to use a little bit of force to move that ball forward, or move that little rocket proton shot forward. So I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to add a variable that will allow me to reference the rigid body. Right, so if you recall from before the video, or the lecture on variables rather, what we did here is we created a private variable, which means it won't be showing up inside of Unity, and it's of data type rigid body, and we named it RB. You can really name it rigid body or anything you like that will better reference it. And what I'd like to do is tell Unity that I'd like to store that rigid body component that's attached. Now if you recall, the start method here is made by Unity, and once the object shows up in the scene, it calls the start method first. So let me pause the video and I'm going to paste in the code that allows you to get the component, which is the rigid body component, attached to that proton shot. So we made the variable here. Rigid body equals the component, the actual rigid body component that's attached. So let me hit Control S to save this. And let's return to Unity and see how this works in action. Alright, I'm just going to drag in this proton shot into our scene. Not the script rather, but the prefab. And you can see here on this prefab, actually let's go back. I'm going to make it public instead of private so we can see it actually accessing it in the viewport. Alright, so here we are. You can see it says private here. I'm just going to type out public. Hit Control S to save this, and let's jump back into Unity. Okay, now here we have our proton shot here. Notice it says none, like it can't find the rigid body. Well, that get component function, or that get component property, what it's going to do is it's going to reference this rigid body and it's going to place it inside of here. So let's press play and see this in action. So you can see that it automatically got the proton shot rigid body, and we have the proton shot object here. Now what we can do is we can access the force or the velocity, which is an attribute of rigid body, and send the sphere forward. Let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so if you recall that our update method runs every frame, so it's continuously running as long as the object is in the scene. So what we're doing here is we're saying we're going to grab that rigid body component, we're going to add some force to it, and we'd like it to be on the z-axis, because this takes one parameter here, and it's saying x, y, and z, and this is a positional thing. And it's saying I want you to add 200 to the relative force of this object. So let's hit Control S to save this, and let's see how this works inside the editor. Alright, so I'm going to move this off to the side a little bit. Remember, this is our x, y, and z. So we're going to be doing 200 units every frame along the z-axis. So it should move in that direction. So let me move it back a little bit and let me press play. See this work? So you can see now it's moving. And also as I left click, because that script is attached to our proton shot object, I can shoot and I can create a lot of these little proton shots. Now there's a problem here when it comes to memory. It's saving or storing all of these proton shots in our scene. So let's go back into Unity and let's destroy this proton shot object after a certain amount of time. So what I'd like to do is in our start method, we're going to use a function that's made by Unity called destroy. And I'll just type this out instead of pasting it so you can see it. But destroy, and if you hit tab, it'll auto-populate it. And it's saying RB here, but what I want to do is I want to destroy this .gameObject. Now if you remember, this .gameObject is referring to whatever this script is attached to, which is the proton shot. And I'd like it to, let's say, destroy after 3 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control S to save this. And let's go back in Unity and see this in action. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and delete this default proton shot here because we have it whenever we left click shoot. So I'm going to go ahead and press play now. And as I left click, you can see it goes, and then as I wait, these should start to delete themselves after 3 seconds. Now let's say you want a little bit more control over the speed of the shot as well as when the object destroys. Let's go back into Visual Studio and add 2 public variables that control both of those things. Alright, here we are back in Unity. I'm going to press play. And if I left click, you can see it deletes them a lot quicker. And if I select my proton shot here, you can see that I have 2 public variables, one for the speed and how long I want it to destroy. So let's say we want to test it, right? We have a bunch of particles and cool stuff. I can make it much slower by going 20, press play. And I can also increase the time if it's too slow, right, to destroy. So I press play here, see how they only last about a second. So I like the 200. I thought that was pretty good, and I'm fine with 1 for now. What I'm going to do later, next week when we cover like asteroids coming down at random locations and destroying them, we can play with these values a little bit more.